From hunting Bismarck to falling to enemy air power, HMS Prince of Wales certainly had an exciting career for how very short it would end up proving to be. The second of the World War II King George V class battleships, she was the most modern of British battleships upon launching, though this would come with an unfortunate early tendency of teething problems. In spite of that, she still managed to spar with Bismarck, survive that battle, and go on to serve in the Mediterranean. She might well have continued that service too, if not for her ill-fated trip to Singapore. I will admit there is a certain level of irony in that life. A ship that fought against Bismarck, famously crippled by a torpedo to the stern. A ship that would, in turn, end up crippled by a torpedo to her own stern. She helped contribute to Bismarck's crippling by air power, only to become one of the most infamous examples of the triumph of aviation over the big gun battleship. But we'll get to that later. Prince of Wales was laid down on January 1st, 1937, though she began life under a different name, that being HMS King Edward VIII, which would be changed fairly early on as King Edward abdicated the throne, which is about the most mild way I can talk about that mess in this kind of video. This name change actually happened so early on that she was renamed before even being laid down. Regardless, with her new name, Prince of Wales would launch on May 3rd, 1939. Her fitting out process would end up fairly drawn out for much the same reason as Victorious, the fact that World War II broke out soon after it began. Even with it being accelerated to speed the process up, she would only commission on January 19th, 1941, and even that was a formality as she still wasn't completely up to proper service. This belated process was probably not helped by the fact that, while she was still being outfitted, she was bombed by the Luftwaffe. This was in August 1940, when the Germans were heavily bombing Britain all over the place. One of the bombs fell between Prince of Wales and the dock she was resting in, around her aft group of secondary guns. When that bomb detonated, it did a surprising amount of damage, mostly because of her incomplete nature, though the blast effect of it going off between the ship and the dock wall certainly didn't help matters. The bomb buckled her plating, popped rivets, and flooded her badly. This was down to a couple reasons. First, her compartments had yet to be made watertight, and her pumping system wasn't operational yet. Second, there had been holes cut into the ship for installation of equipment, and with that equipment not yet installed, that just let more water in. The ship would end up listing about 8 to 10 degrees to port before the flooding could be gotten under control, which required the efforts of a fire department and the shipyard working together. The sad thing is, all that damage was from one 250-pound bomb. Goes to show how vulnerable a ship is if caught under construction. That being said, once the damage was under control, Prince of Wales was dry docked for proper repairs. While the bomb damage in of itself did little to delay her completion timetable, couple that with the delays on her guns and turrets, and she would enter service later than they ideally wanted her to. Even her accelerated timetable relied a lot on putting her into service without the usual testing a new ship undergoes, to make up for all those delays. Testing that is generally done on sea trials and the like, because any ship has teething issues that need to be worked out. But, well, Britain was desperate for any kind of capital ship they could get their hands on. I'm sure that would end up biting them later. During the early months of 1941, between her formal commissioning and properly joining the fleet at the end of March, Prince of Wales would undertake an abbreviated sea trials period. During this, her guns would suffer so many malfunctions and general issues that civilian technicians had to stay aboard to make fixes on the fly. These had become infamous in later years as an example of how terrible the British quad turrets were. I will say that's generally overplayed a bit. The guns and turrets definitely had issues, but generally speaking, so would any new turret design. And Prince of Wales was also only the second of her class, which means she had even more issues than otherwise would have been the case. Either way, these issues were there, and 2 of her turrets, presumably the temperamental quads, were only formally handed over to the Royal Navy on April 27, 1941. Eagle-eyed viewers who know their history will note this is less than a month before Prince of Wales would enter her first engagement. For come May 22nd, she would join up with Hood to try and block the new German battleship Bismarck from breaking into the Atlantic. Prince of Wales, in this action, would prove to be more fortunate than Hood in that she didn't blow up, but at the same time she would also prove to have issues that prevented her from serving at her best. First and foremost, she had only just entered service, so her crew was not exactly the most experienced in the world. Secondly, design flaws in Prince of Wales would rear their head here. It is well known that British ships were out of position and only able to use their bow turrets at first. Prince of Wales was further hampered in that she was designed to be able to fire directly over her bow, which meant she was a very wet ship. Such was the issue here, in fact, that she couldn't properly use her turret rangefinders and had to rely entirely on her control tower. Not that this would be the only issue. Her teething issues, only recently quote-unquote fixed, began to act up again. Luckily for Prince of Wales, her captain had personally requested those civilian technicians to stay aboard for exactly this reason. Unfortunately, even with men who knew the guns and their mounts inside and out, she still had issues. One gun in her fore turret broke down, and when she turned away later in the battle, her stern turret jammed entirely. With this and other issues cropping up, Prince of Wales was, at times, down to just 2 working guns. And yet, in spite of all of that, she still managed 2 hits on Bismarck. These hits were not crippling or anything like that, but what they did do was almost as important. One of the hits caused Bismarck to steadily leak fuel oil while contaminating what remained aboard. Another exploded beneath the German ship's armor, flooding a boiler room and slowing her down. The combination of these, in addition to Victorious's later airstrike worsening the damage, would keep Bismarck slowed and leaking fuel, leading, directly, to the ability to track her down and finish her off later. Unfortunately for Prince of Wales, again, she would take damage in return. Nothing so catastrophic as Hood, but she still took a fairly major pounding from Prince Eugen and Bismarck's guns. She took a handful of hits here, including one directly to her bridge. That succeeded in killing or wounding basically everyone there, with one notable exception, as it would turn out, of her captain. He escaped unharmed, which is probably fortunate for the ship in that battle. Other shells pounded her hull, letting in something like 400 tons of water, with one shell diving beneath her belt and ending near her boiler rooms. At the time, that shell being a dud must have been seen as a very good thing, especially in light of Hood's fate. Later on, it became accepted that such a shell wouldn't have actually been a danger. Had the fuse actually worked, it wouldn't have gotten anywhere near Prince of Wales before blowing up underwater. It being a dud, ironically, is the only reason it even penetrated her armor. In any case, with her turret issues and the compounding damage and being outnumbered, Prince of Wales turned away. She would join up with the cruisers pursuing Bismarck and open fire on the Germans a couple more times, but no more shells would hit. With continuing issues with her guns and Bismarck managing to slip away, Prince of Wales licked her wounds and sailed for Iceland. Her first engagement had not been the most successful thing in the world. Still, the ship did well considering her issues. She hurt Bismarck and kept her crew alive. That's not a bad thing. After she was patched up, Prince of Wales would carry Churchill across the Atlantic for a conference with President Roosevelt in August before returning back to Britain, whereupon she would be sent out again, this time to the Mediterranean. In September 1941, she joined Force H with HMS Rodney and assorted cruisers and destroyers. While there, Prince of Wales took part in Operation Halberd, one of the missions to supply Malta. In the course of that operation, Prince of Wales shot down several Italian aircraft with her 5.25-inch guns. This was a good performance, though it might have made the British a tad overconfident in how her anti-aircraft guns could handle air attack. After a brief detour to try and intercept Italian ships that came to nothing, Prince of Wales returned to Scapa Flow. As it would turn out, this would be her last time in British waters, for come October, she would join up with HMS Repulse to set off for the Far East. This operation, as foreseen, was actually severely cut down from what it was initially intended to be. While it is fairly well known, if you've read up on the topic, that HMS Indomitable was supposed to go along for air cover, that wasn't the initial plan. Initially, the British had a much more expansive plan for their Eastern Fleet. They wanted to send both the Nelsons, both Renown and Repulse, and all 4 remaining R-class battleships to join the Eastern Fleet. All of this to basically point at Japan and go, "Are you man enough?" That plan was, probably understandably, ditched fairly early on, as the Royal Navy couldn't possibly concentrate that kind of force until 1942. And even if they had done so, Tirpitz was still being a general menace in Norway, and they needed battleships to counter her. Moreover, the R-class were far more useful as convoy escorts, keeping the Germans from using surface raiders to their fullest. This isn't even touching on the need to actually refit that many ships for Eastern service. So, with that plan gone, you instead got the single battleship, the battlecruiser, and the carrier. Even this was changed up, as the British initially wanted to send Ark Royal after a refit, but, well, U-boats happened. And with Indomitable running herself aground and requiring repairs, you instead ended up with just Prince of Wales and Repulse with a handful of destroyers. Not exactly a big force, though it was optimistically hoped that it would still deter the Japanese. Unfortunately, the very publicized journey of 4C only succeeded in giving the Japanese plenty of warning and time to prepare for sinking the ships. After arriving in Singapore on December 2nd, Prince of Wales and Repulse would only have a short break before Japan declared war. First, through setting out very obvious troop convoys before they had actually formally declared war. Then, through attacking Pearl Harbor, which caused issues as the British were rather relying on the threat of the USN to help their small force. And finally, through attacking up and down the Dutch East Indies and other Allied holdings, including air raids on Singapore. The British, wary of landing operations, elected to send Prince of Wales and Repulse out with 4 destroyers for escort. Admiral Phillips was confident he would have RAF air cover, though as it would turn out, this would not materialize. That would end up having less than ideal consequences. The RAF did offer some planes for air cover later on, though this was rejected. In any event, with the mission of hitting Japanese troop ships, 4C sailed off to its destiny. By December 9th, they had already been spotted by a Japanese submarine, I-65. They were further tracked by Japanese aircraft that night, though the Japanese would lose sight of the British in stormy weather. Until, that is, 4C diverted to investigate a landing operation, which brought them into the sights of another Japanese submarine around 2 in the morning on December 10th. One of the greatest missed opportunities of the war came in that time period of neither side knew where the other was. A group of Japanese cruisers and destroyers were about 5 miles away from the British and searching for them. A flare dropped by a Japanese aircraft, who mistook their own ships for the British, was even seen aboard the British ships, which made them worry they had been found. Alas, with Prince of Wales' radar not quite working in the tropical conditions, the British and Japanese would completely miss each other. Considering the British skill at night combat against cruisers, it's an interesting what-if to imagine. Though it is worth noting that the Japanese were better trained at night combat than the Italians, and had a lot of long lances, and would presumably not be caught with their pants down helping a crippled comrade. Either way, the fleets missed each other. Worried about losing the element of surprise at this point, Admiral Phillips turned his ships back for Singapore. Unfortunately, this was too late, especially coupled with a decoy landing drawing the British out, so they ended up caught by the enemy. The Japanese attacked around noon on the 10th, throwing G3M bombers, Nels to use the reporting name, at the British. At first, the Japanese tried dropping bombs. This attack was focused on Repulse, while Prince of Wales would escape at first, only to have more Nels attack her with torpedoes instead. The British ship would dodge 7 torpedoes, though not the 8th. That last torpedo succeeded in hitting Prince of Wales, in perhaps the worst possible location, outside her torpedo defense system, right on top of her outer propeller shaft on the port side. That single hit did far and away more damage than it would have done had it hit anywhere else. It wrecked that propeller shaft, bending it out of shape, but not shutting it down. This resulted in the shaft running wild before someone aboard ship could shut power, which led to it shredding the entire area around it. Prince of Wales was, in the end, crippled by her own propulsion. The damage from the shaft running wild destroyed bulkheads and left a long alley of damage open to the sea, flooding all the way back to her engine rooms. With her power shut off to the after end of the ship, Prince of Wales couldn't do proper damage control, even lacking pumps, and began to list badly. I'll note here, this is not a knock on her design. Pretty much any ship hit like that would have suffered pretty badly. Regardless, now slowed and listing, Prince of Wales was a far easier target for follow-on attacks. Her anti-aircraft weaponry, already hampered by her radar malfunctioning, was further reduced by the list pointing the weapons away from their actual targets, those that could still operate, considering the lack of power. Prince of Wales will be hit by 3 further torpedoes, this time by Mitsubishi Bettys, which caused further flooding. A hit by a 1,000-pound bomb that exploded on her main deck was largely secondary to her sinking, though it did kill or maim many men in a makeshift aid center. Ironically enough, it was probably the near misses in that attack that did more damage. These repeated what had happened to her way back in 1940. They popped hull plates and rivets, causing further flooding. It would be soon after this attack, around 1:10 p.m., that Prince of Wales was abandoned. Soon after, she capsized and sank stern first. She took 327 men with her, including both Admiral Phillips and Captain Leach, who had previously survived the encounter with Bismarck. The sinking of Prince of Wales and Repulse would prove to be a major shock to outside observers. For the first time, capital ships had been sunk at sea by air power. No surface action at all. While this was probably the best case scenario for the Japanese, with the lack of escort and the forewarning to prepare an attack, it still showed how the future was moving to air power over the big gun. Would the same result have happened had the British ships had air cover of their own? Or more effective radar and escorts? Tough to say. Either way, the sinking would be heard around the world, as it were. Unfortunately, in later years, while the Royal Navy continues to pay respects to the sunken warships to this day, illegal salvagers have done as they typically do in that part of the world. Hunting for low background steel, these men have blasted and torn apart Prince of Wales and Repulse. The damage is very visible to divers, though by no means the worst case of this action. That dubious honor belongs to ships in the Java Sea that have been stripped to the point where only the place they landed is visible. In any case, this brazen violation of war graves remains something of a black mark and a poor respect for the legacy of HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed the content, and I'll see you in the next one.